get started so I don't run out of time. I'm Uchu Dasgupta, the CDS, and Ranjana Dasgupta, Uchu Dasgupta. I'm the director of the Institute of. And once a year, we do this growing symposium with the Computational CSSI, and it's a way to bring together different institutes that are interdisciplinary, that promotes research that sort of in some way steps out of the normal silos of that. So I want to tell you just a few words about the Institute and then hand it over to Krista and Brendan. Let's see. All right. So actually I should say, so today we have two speakers, Andrew Cohen and Qian Zhao. Each person will speak for about 20 minutes, and then we leave 15 minutes for Q&A. And Krista and I will jointly try to keep time. We want to leave enough time for Q&A because we want to get more discussion, and then time at the end for all of you to mingle if you're interested in the second research. One other thing is that at IDS and also CSSI, we are really interested in graduate students who might be interested in presenting their research, because research is broadly speaking on the university and/or computational method. I asked Michaela and Cassandra and Venezuela, who are members of our S team, so that we can say that this is my name, my department, and if you're faculty or postdoc, they're also interested too, but I feel like grad students often are under the radar, so I want to call you out in particular. Okay, so the goal of IDS is to incentivize translational interdisciplinary research by especially research that is broadly connected to issues of justice, broadly speaking. That justice might be diversity, it might be equality, it might be access, different fields have different names. Our goal is to sort of emphasize interdisciplinarity and STEM connected to. We do it in two ways. One is every year in February, we have an annual grants competition. Of which the grant amount is $5,000, depending on specifics. And the team has to have KPIs for different departments, has to have students, grad or undergrad, and the topic has to be research in some way, diversity or justice or something. We just finished and they're in the review process now. But if you're interested, come talk to me or look on our website, you will see the call for proposal. We also do sort of what I think of as national collaboration fields to present their research, just like this, because that's a way that we found that people find each other across disciplines. And three, we have some professional development for students, especially professional development programs that teach students skills that are not STEM content, but how to navigate the culture of science and engineering, and especially understand the for the ones, especially those of you who are students. The QR code and the active URL points you to our Google form if you're interested in being affiliated with us, which essentially means you want to know about the grants, you want to know about the seminars, you want to know about speakers we invite. That's what becoming interested. Grab that QR code, and I think that's it. Oh, this is the seed grant page on our website. So the grant is now currently, the cycle is now closed, but keep an eye on it. It's usually the deadline is right to the beginning. And you can see, if you go on our website, you can see how the grants funded so far. All right, with that, I'm going to hand off to Krista.
Thank you, Buju, for the welcome and for working to pull this together. My name is Krista Guile, and I am one of the co-directors, along with Raymond O'Connor, of the Computational Social Science Institute. And our associate director, Shoaib, is not here today, but is also with us in spirit. Computational Social Science Institute looking at research at the intersection of the computational sciences and the social. So, um, so we have a nice synergy with IDS, who has this interest in cross-disciplinary synergy also, but with a little bit more of a content, more specialized content focus than we have. So it's lovely to do these events at least annually where we bring people together at the intersection of both of our intersections. So we do have some upcoming events in the spring. We have events basically every spring. All of which are on our website, and the last of which is a student poster event. So if you're working with a student or you are a student, mostly graduate students, but undergraduates as well, we're working on research related to computational social science. Please keep your eyes out for the announcement about this poster competition and come share your work. It's a really exciting event also where we have students from lots of different disciplines who come together and share work. I'll also mention we also have two things. We have an events email list. So if you're interested in being on our events list, then that means that you just get event emails about things like this. And we also have an affiliates list. And the affiliates, we profile them on our website. It's another way that we try to connect people. And every so often we'll have a big survey or something that's targeted at affiliates rather than people on the events list. So if you're interested in not only just passively receiving emails about things that are going on, but also having your profile featured on our website and getting emails about a little bit more targeted mixer type events, then that's for faculty, then consider becoming an affiliate as well. And you can join those things either by emailing us, so there's a link on this page, or I believe the folks doing the signups are collecting interest. So, anything you want to add, Brendan? Okay, thanks so much for being here today. I'm really excited about having these two talks and having them juxtaposed and our dialogue around them. And so our first speaker is Andrew Cohen, who is a professor in the Psychological and Brain Sciences Department. And I'll turn it over to you, Andrew. Thank you for being here.
All right, hi everyone. First, I have to navigate technology. Give me just a second. Excellent. Hi. Thanks to all of you for being here, braving the cold, maybe to walk across campus to get here. My name is Andrew Cohen. I am a cognitive psychologist in PBS, and I study human decision-making using computational modeling. I am going to be talking about lineups, race, models, and measurement. This is different from the title that was in the poster. My fault, my apologies. This is work that was done with Melissa Khan, Jeff Starnes, Alicia Reed, and others. And Buju reminded me that early versions of this work were funded by an IDS grant. So apply for them, they turn into great stuff. And actually, I presented early versions of this work 3 years ago, but you'll see it's now published, so you'll see some final version plus some next steps. The material, I mean, just those 4 words is way more than a 20-minute talk. So I'm going to keep everything at very high level. And I know this is a computational talk. There are no equations, although I doubt anyone here is going to complain about that. My purpose here is to introduce the scope of this work, especially as it relates to computational modeling, and to try to foster some collaborations. All right, so we had issues with my computer, so I'm going low tech here a little bit. Let's just, given the time limit, let's just jump right in. So we're talking about lineups, eyewitness lineups. And the eyewitness lineup procedure is as follows. Let me see if I can actually point here. Let me get my pointer ready, hopefully. All right, so a witness views a perpetrator commit a crime. The police catch a suspect. The suspect may or may not be guilty. They then put the suspect into a lineup. And, oh, sorry, I need to move this. And in that lineup, the suspect is surrounded by what are called fillers. These are people who are known to be innocent. And the fillers are picked by the lineup constructor, usually a law enforcement officer. That lineup is then presented to a witness who either identifies someone in the lineup as the perpetrator or fails to identify someone and says the perpetrator is not present. Now, I can talk for a long time on the importance of lineups and their role in law enforcement and how they matter. I want to hit, however, just two main points here. So I'll just describe these data, and hopefully that'll hit those 2 points as they relate to lineups and race. So the first, these are data from the Innocence Project. Definitely check that out. Since 1989, 70% of recorded wrongful convictions that were overturned by DNA evidence involved high confidence eyewitness misidentifications. What this means is that identifications on the stand have a oversized impact on jurors. The second is that 53% of all recorded wrongful convictions involved Black defendants, which is, of course, way higher than coercion. And eyewitness misidentifications were involved in 1/3 of these cases. So 2 points on this slide: lineups matter, race matters. So what questions are we addressing, particularly as they relate to lineups and race? First, how do the following factors affect lineup performance? The race of the perpetrator or suspect, which is usually, not always, but usually the same. The race of the lineup constructor and the race of the witness. We're also asking how collection of fillers affect lineup performance. How should we be conducting lineups? That's not just how to pick the fillers, but there's a whole slew of other issues surrounding lineup construction. And how should we be measuring lineup performance? I'll be focusing, this is a lot, I'll be focusing on a subset of these questions and really just touch on some of the others. The approach we take involves behavioral or experimental data, perceptual models, which I'll talk about later as face spaces, computational models, and these can be either descriptive statistical or process-oriented models. I'll talk about that later, and measurement techniques for how to determine whether you're succeeding or not in your approach. So this talk is really broken into 2 parts. The purple outlined on the left is the lineup construction aspect. That's where I'm going to be focusing most of my time. And the second is the eyewitness lineup aspect of things, which I'll be going over much more briefly at the end. So let's talk about this first part of lineup construction. Now, one other thing that I want to point out here is that the race of the perpetrator and the race of the witness are fixed by circumstance. But the race of the lineup constructor is not. We can determine who constructs the lineup. So the main question here that we were asking is who should construct the lineup? Does it matter? And you might imagine that it matters because of something like the cross-race effect. And I'm sure there are people in this room who know way more about this than me. So I'm just going to give this a 1-sentence introduction, which is that people are, in general, worse at identifying faces from races other than their own. And you can imagine that has a huge impact when picking faces to put into a lineup or when picking people out of a lineup. All right, so how does this relate directly to lineups and the lineup process? We're going to use the face spaces that I mentioned earlier. These are spaces that are generated using multidimensional scaling, or MDS. MDS is a technique that takes a set of distances and turns them into a spatial configuration. So in other words, a paradigmatic example is if you give me the distances between 5 cities and I apply MDS, it gives me a map of the relative positions of those 5 cities. So looking at it in the terms of eyewitness lineups and face spaces, what we did is as follows. We had faces of Black people and white people, and we had Black observers and white observers. I'm not showing the full cross here. This is just for Black faces with Black and white observers. we had about 100 faces, roughly. And what we did was we presented the observer with pairs of faces, all pairs of faces, or a lot of them, and asked them to rate those faces on a similarity scale. Similarity is our proxy for distance, such that high similarity means smaller distance, you're closer together. We then took those similarities, applied MDS, and it gives you out a spatial configuration of these faces, such that faces that are close together in the space are more similar to each other. Faces that are far apart in the space are less similar to each other. Couple things, though, about this slide of interest is that we only presented homogeneous race faces to each observer. In other words, they only saw either black or white people, not both, which is different from every other study we saw in the literature. And I think that matters a lot. And I can talk about that later if there's interest. The other thing is I'm only showing you the first two dimensions here. This multi-dimensional space. I obviously can't show you all the dimensions. So the first question that we asked of these spaces is, do they differ for a given race of face? Does the observer race differ? And I don't have a separate slide for this because no matter how we sliced it, the answer was no, interestingly. We were a little surprised by this, and this contradicts like all literature that we've seen in the past, but the relative similarity of these faces, black faces or white faces, for black observers or white observers, we couldn't find any significant difference between the two. So that's the first take-home message, is that the face spaces, given the relative similarity between these faces, did not differ across the race of the observer. We can then use these spaces in the context of lineups. So first we need to get the lineups. So we did that using a lineup construction process. So we took those same 100 black faces, same 100 white faces, and we did the following. So we gave the lineup constructor, who was just some online person, not actual law enforcement person, one of those 100 faces as the suspect. And then we gave them the other 99 faces to choose as fillers and said, pick your 5 fillers that you want. If you want, here are the criteria. We told them, protect innocent suspects from being falsely identified and help the eyewitnesses correctly identify a guilty suspect. So that was sort of their goal. We had black and white lineup constructors. So the races here don't match, but I didn't have a full set of figures. But the idea is you get out lineups like these. So this may have been the suspect. The box is for you, not the actual subjects. And then the fillers were the ones that were picked by the lineup constructors. All right, so what do we do with these? And how do we combine that with the face spaces that we talked about earlier? What we want is a measure of these lineups that we can compare across the race of the lineup constructor that is based on this face space. We did a lot of things. I'm just going to focus on this one, which is fairness. So in essence, what the fairness measure tells you is how much the suspect sticks out from the fillers. Is it more similar to everyone else, like a prototype? Is it less similar, like someone very distinctive? Or is it kind of right in the mix? Mathematically, what we did was imagine that this guy over here, the red box, is the suspect, and these blue circles are the fillers. Essentially, we have the average distance of the suspect to all the fillers, and then the average distance of all the fillers to everyone else. And we just compared those two averages. If they're equal, it's a fair lineup. If they're not equal, it's unfair lineup. And what you see here is an example of a fair lineup because the suspect is kind of right in the mix with everyone else. It's no more similar or less similar than all the fillers are to each other. And what we see on the right is an unfair lineup because the fillers, it's less obvious, but the fillers are more similar to each other than the suspect is. And in this case, the suspect sticks out. So we have a fair lineup and an unfair lineup. All right, so what do we do with these? Let me orient you to this graph. You'll see this again. So we'll take a second to do that. Essentially what we have are These are data for black suspects and white suspects. Within each of these, we have, using the face space from black observers and white observers, black observers, white observers, 4 lineups constructed by black lineup constructors and white lineup constructors. We plotted fairness. That's what's on the x-axis. I know it's small because the numbers don't really matter. The histograms are individual subject fairness scores. So remember what happened is we had people construct lineups for black people or white people, and they were black or white themselves, and we constructed a fairness measure for each of those lineups using the face space. These are the individual subject data you're looking at now. The means are these black bars. And the reason I can throw all these data up at once for you is that there are no differences. Like, these are almost identical across any combination of suspect, observer, or lineup constructor. So that's take home number 2. We found, contrary to our expectations, we found no difference in the face space or the constructed lineups across race of the perpetrator, the suspect, or the lineup constructor. But we can do some really cool things with these face spaces. For example, we can simulate what the fairness scores would look like if the lineup constructors were following certain rules. For example, or certain strategies, I should say. For example, given a particular suspect, is the lineup constructor just trying to find people who are as similar as possible to that suspect and sticking them together? Kind of like this lineup that you're looking at right here. That's actually, in the literature, something that is suggested that people do. So the way we would do that is, given a suspect in the filler, in the space, you pick fillers stochastically maybe that are similar to the suspect. For each of those simulated lineups, you can then construct a fairness score. And you can compare that fairness score to the score that you actually got from the real empirical lineup constructors. The idea is that if they're far away from each other, then that's probably not the strategy that people were using. If they're similar to each other, that's support that maybe that's the strategy people were using. We had a whole bunch of different strategies, which I'm not really going to talk about for the interest of time, but the data looks something like this. We have the same setup that we had before. So we have black suspect and white suspect for black observers and white observers, for black lineup constructors and white lineup constructors. The x-axis, again, is the fairness score, and these black lines are the means that you saw here. So those are the empirical data, and what you can immediately see is that some of the strategies are very far away from those means. We can kind of discount those as not what people are doing, but it is consistent with others, such as, it's being hidden by my Zoom screen, but I think homogeneous similar, random, and fair. So using this face space, we can get at what kinds of strategies are consistent with what people are doing to construct these lineups. But again, critically for this talk, no differences across the race of perpetrator, suspect, observer, or lineup constructor. So that's take home number 2. Part 2 of the talk, which is going to go surprisingly faster than part 1 of the talk. This is the lineup eyewitness side of things. So given a lineup, how do witnesses act in those lineups? So far we've seen very few differences. You're going to start seeing race differences now, however. So we have these lineup models. Can't go through these. These are process models that they're mathematical models of the lineup process from the eyewitness point of view. So the goal of these models is to generate eyewitness responses, like identifying faces or rejecting the lineup, maybe at different confidence levels. And these models do an excellent job doing that. So these are circles and X's right on top of each other. Data and model align really well. I can't go through the details, but they work really well to explain human performance in these tasks. Something that's an ongoing project right now is we're incorporating face spaces into this so that we can get fine-grained predictions for individual lineups, not just groups of lineups at the high level. These are signal detection models. If you're interested, I can talk about them later, but I can't go into the details because Buju is already showing me small numbers there. But there are 2 parameters that I want to point out. The first is mu. Mu, basically tells you how discriminable people find innocent suspects from guilty suspects. Higher mu is better, lower mu is worse. Over here, we see empirical data for Black witnesses and white witnesses, for Black suspects and white suspects. And here we start seeing differences. So Black witnesses find Black and white suspects equally discriminable, but white witnesses find Black suspects less discriminable than white suspects. Relatedly, there's another parameter called C, which is a criterion, a response criteria. Essentially what it does is it tells you how likely the witness is just to respond, to identify someone. High values mean you're less likely to pick somebody, you're more conservative. Low values mean you're more likely to pick someone, you're more liberal. And again, we see race differences. Not for Black witnesses who are about equal in their responding to Black and white suspects, but we do for white witnesses where they're less likely to identify a white suspect than a Black suspect. That's what this higher value means. Moving to the last thing I want to discuss, which is measurement. I'm actually really excited to talk about this to this group because I'm sure there are people who know this much more than me. But Jeff Starnes and I have been introducing this idea of expected information gain to the eyewitness literature. And it's an information theoretic measure that builds on the work of Claude Shannon. I love citing myself next to Claude Shannon there. And this has been rated as one of the most important mathematical concepts of the 20th century. We can argue about that if you want. But if you need any more evidence, if you like Moodle, if you look at your Moodle results, they provide, I know it's small, but they provide information theoretic based measures on your word guesses. So next time you play Moodle, you can get that. I geek out on this sort of thing. But we're applying this to lineups. So in a lineup context, what EIG tells you is how much information about the guilt or innocence of the suspect you gain from the witness response. High values mean you're more or less confident about the guilt of the suspect after you see the witness response. Low values mean you're less confident about how much information you gain about the guilt or innocence of the suspect after the witness response. It has lots of advantages over existing measures, which I can't go into now. But here are the empirical data for, again, Black and white witnesses for Black and white suspects, and same story. Essentially, Black people, witnesses give equal amount of information, regardless of the race of the suspect, but white witnesses give less information about the guilt or innocence of Black suspects relative to white suspects. So that's your take-home message number 3. And because Buju told me time is up, I will jump right to the conclusions. So these are the questions we asked at the beginning of the talk. Here are some interim and partial answers. How do the following factors affect lineup performance? The race of the perpetrator suspect. Black suspects are disadvantaged. But surprisingly for us, it didn't have much to do with the lineup constructor. More, it was the race of the witness where we saw a cross-race effect for white witnesses. But we can help ameliorate this a little bit, which is stuff we're currently working on. For example, by strategically picking fillers to make the lineups more informative and more useful. Fillers matter a lot. Like how you pick the fillers change performance considerably. There's a lot of evidence for this, and this is ongoing research that we're working on. Secondly, how should we conduct lineups? For example, how many fillers? Should you present them sequentially or simultaneously? Matters a lot, again. And this is, again, ongoing research. Happy to talk about that more. And finally, just because I want to plug it again, I think EIG is, there are other important measures, but it's something that we should be in the mix in terms of how to measure lineup performance. So, thank you. How over was I, Buju? Okay, I'm happy to take questions or not. Yeah. Yeah, so Melissa Khan is the first author in this. I didn't do this, but she did. One of the things that we did was run this through some biometric information to get some measures of like eye distance and those. And we then used that as the similarity measure instead of humans. And she compared that to the human measures. And this is going to be a disappointing ending. I don't remember what she found. It did not make the paper. So it's been years since I've seen that. But yes, that is an approach that other people have used. I wouldn't be surprised if there's some systematic deviations, but I can't speak to that with any sort of confidence. But if there, I mean, I should say more generally that there's strong interest in the use of not only that kind of measure, but artificially generated faces in the lineup process. There are clearly problems with that because one obvious one is that the picture of the suspect is not going to be artificial, but all the fillers would be, which is potentially a big issue. But I know there are people looking at ways of picking fillers using, face generation type software. That's still kind of in its infancy, and I really hope police don't do that in the near future. But that's, I think, where things are going to move to. Did I answer your question? You had a question?
Yeah, thanks.
Oh, please do.
But can you give us an intuition about how you can get a more fair process by picking fillers?
Well, let me put it this way. You can get a less fair process.
Okay.
Yeah. Well, one way we were anticipating was to have, for example, the race of the lineup constructor match that of the suspect. Didn't bear out in our data. I wouldn't be surprised if it doesn't in the future in some ways, but in our data, it did not. So I want to be careful because by fair, I assume you mean like for the white witnesses kind of equalize the suspect race.
So what you really like is more accuracy for the black suspects. You don't necessarily want to make the accuracy lower for white suspects. You want to raise the accuracy for black suspects.
Well, you want to raise it for everyone, right?
Yeah.
I can answer that question more confidently. That's the kind of thing we're working on. So humans have a lot of perceptual constraints, a lot of memorial constraints, a lot of decision-making biases that we use. And all of those are at play in lineups, right? There's a memory of the perpetrator and you're comparing that to the suspect, and those can degrade in different ways over time. There are different things that it's been shown that people attend to different parts of the face depending on what the task is and what race the face is. Although that's more complicated because that can change depending on the task. And there are decision-making components. We saw one of those with the C measure, such that you could, even given a particular memorial trace, given a particular face space, given a particular discriminability, you can still be more or less likely to choose. So what you can do is pick the fillers, and there's been a lot of work on this and some ongoing in our lab. You can pick the fillers to maximize the ability of the witness to discriminate guilty from innocent suspects. You can also, instruction-wise, tell people to be more or less conservative. You can also do things like change the way in which you present the lineup to the witnesses. For example, simultaneously, like we did here, is thought to encourage more relational processing compared to things like serial presentation, where I show you one of these faces at a time, which is thought to encourage more absolute comparison between the perpetrator memory and what you're currently looking at. Other things you can do is think about what you actually do with the resulting measure. If I tell you that, let's see. Right, so one thing you could do is construct lineups in a certain way. You can conduct lineups in a certain way, but you can also measure lineups in a certain way. So you, given a particular result, you identify this person. How confident should I really be in the guilt or innocence of that person? And I think that's an important one that could help with fairness, because given this result, if you have a white person identifying a black suspect, you should be less confident in that result, right? And maybe down the line, I don't know how to do this, but incorporate that into sentencing or, guilt or innocence, things like that, right? Complicated issue, but theoretically, that's how you would incorporate it. And that's why one of the reasons I really like EIG, because it tells you how confident you should be in the result you get, and you could definitely see this cross-race. So, yeah.
Sorry, this is a question, but empirically, how correct is it to reduce the line of justice? I guess what I'm asking is, I don't know this well enough, but in an actual lineup, how much do other things such as height, body build, size, identifying attributes, how do these things?
Yeah, so they all matter. Well, height, not so much, because now they pretty much do this with pictures. So you typically don't get the height information. But the way, all right, I'll tell you the way lineups should be constructed, which is by someone who's blind to who the suspect is. And they're different. There's been a big literature on this, on how you should pick the fillers. It goes back decades. And one of the big distinctions was, should you pick the people to be similar to the suspect or just to a description of the suspect? Like, for example, if you know the suspect is a white guy with a mustache in Carolina or whatever, middle-aged, medium build, all of your, sorry, let me take that back. A description from the witness, not having the suspect. What you should do is pick fillers to match that description. And in fact, that's what we've done here. So all of the people, 100 people, roughly matched that description. They were all roughly the same age, roughly the same build, same race, things like that. So that's how you should do it. And you should not have the law enforcement officer in the room with you. You should get no feedback. There's been a lot of literature showing that if you get post-identification feedback that's positive, your confidence in the correctness of your identification shoots up. So even very simple things, like if you pick somebody and say, I think it's that guy there, and the law enforcement officer behind you goes, okay, even that can increase your confidence later at trial. So yes, there are a lot of things that can influence performance, and sometimes things are done very badly. So for example, there are cases, a lot of times the person constructing the lineup knows who the suspect is, and that can create some problems, right? They're in the room with the person. There were some problems in Northampton a few years ago, I'm not gonna remember who it was, where I might get this wrong, so please bear with me, but the basic idea is right, where the witness kept picking a filler and the law enforcement officer was behind them saying, well, are you sure you don't want to keep looking, right? So there are a lot of miscarriages, I should say, in the way it works. So there's a big difference between theory and practice sometimes, but hopefully we're moving on that direction. It's a good question. There are other factors at play here. Buju? Oh, while you guys are thinking, I want to apologize to the next speaker. I teach across campus in just a few minutes, so I do have to leave early. So I know that's really rude. I apologize. Yeah. Oh, was there a second hand? I don't think so.
All right, I'll keep going. Thanks. You touched on a little bit. You said that you didn't see differences. You put up that slide. The one where you said there are no differences.
I saw that in a few places, here and here.
Yeah.
Yeah.
You have some numbers over there?
Yeah.
And the parentheses are probably standard errors of some sort, and the numbers are all solid standard errors. Is
It's not bounded at 0.
You said that in the future, there may be differences found here. Is there a small sample size issue, or why do you say that? For a measurement?
No, I'm just saying that we haven't measured everything you can measure.
What was the sample size, like, how was it studied?
So we had so for the lineup, let's see, for the face space, we had about 90 participants in each observer group. And for the lineup construction, we had 40, but it was also within subject design. So we had a lot of data per participant. And the way we measured this, so this is individual subject data. So it's going to be much more variable than these are not standard errors. These are standard deviations from the population, from the sample. And yeah, you can't compare the numbers because it's not bounded at 0. So it can go negative or positive. What we essentially did was look at, we did some analyses looking at assuming, replicability within subject, how much variability we would assume across group. And using that, we found very little evidence of difference. I think we did a power analysis up front to make sure we had enough power. Yeah, but early days, I mean, yeah, if you guys have other measures you want to look at, I'm happy to consider them. We can break up these data in lots of different ways. All right. Okay. Thank you. Thanks. Oh.
So our next speaker is Polish. All right, so Krista will dive upward.
Thank you. Right, but you're still sharing, actually. Could you stop sharing? I might be able to kick you out by sharing the other side. But... Thank you. He's still sharing. Thank you. So like who says, our next speaker is my colleague Qian Zhao, who's an assistant professor of statistics in the Department of Statistics. And I think actually this seems to be the version that's making it move without you moving it. So let's not do that. There you go.
Hi everyone. Hi everyone. My name is Chen, and I'm an assistant professor in math and stats. And today I will tell you a bit about our work in estimating food insecurity. And our goal is to estimate food insecurity at a granular level, and at the same time give us some understanding of the mechanism of food insecurity, and also inform some policy solutions. This is a joint effort with a lot of researchers from across campus, and we also this is also a collaborative effort of students, graduate students and undergraduate students from multiple disciplines. And our work was funded by IDS last year in the SEED grant. So this is still a work in progress. I will tell you a bit about what we have been working on, and hopefully in a couple of years, we'll come back to tell you more about what we're doing. So let me get started. So there's a saying that food is medicine, so it probably doesn't surprise you when I say that food insecurity is associated with many adverse health outcomes. So on the left, I'm showing a figure. So this is a graph showing how food insecurity could lead to chronic health issues for adults, and also developmental and cognitive development issues in children. And on the right, there's a graph that shows how food insecurity is associated with being admitted to acute care more frequently for a variety of reasons. These are probably may not be surprising to you. And these days, food insecurity has received more attention lately. And despite that, when I first saw the statistics, I was still pretty surprised because in 2023, about 18 million US households experience food insecurity at some point during the year. And that's a really big number when I first heard it. So by that, this means these households, maybe they were not certain that they will be able to acquire sufficient amount of food that they would like to eat that meets the needs of all of the members of the household. And this is what we see on the blue line here. And on the orange line, that shows a more severe kind of food insecurity, which means that that household needs to reduce their food intake, like reduce the quantity of the food they take or the dietary patterns. So this is a more severe form. So now I would like to invite you to look at these two visualizations yourself. So if you Google USDA food insecurity interactive visualization, they'll take you to this website, which shows some visualizations of food insecurity. If you look at this website, this is Food Access Research Atlas, which tells you food access across the US. So I would like you to spend 2 minutes to take a look at these two websites, and then I'll ask you to talk to someone next to you for a minute about what do you observe from this graph, what are something that you learned for the first time, what factors are associated with higher risk of food insecurity, and maybe what state has higher level of food insecurity. Just try for 2 minutes. And while we're waiting, I can also click into this website, show it to you. Oh, okay. So while we're waiting, I'll also show you some of the graphs. So if you don't have a phone or if you just Google food insecurity interactive charts USDA, I'll just show you a few graphs. This is the USDA Food Research Atlas. That shows us which place in the United States have both higher level of poverty rate and also a lower access, physical access to food. Now I'd like to invite you to talk to someone briefly about what you notice about this that you may find interesting or surprising, or some factors that you noticed. Okay, so let's come back to let's come back from our discussions. So you may notice a few factors. Okay, let's come back from the discussions. Sorry, let's come back from the discussions. So you may have noticed a few factors. So first of all, you probably noticed that individual level factors affect food insecurity. So for instance, what's your education level, what's your household income, and if you have some disability, etc. So this is a graph you might see on the website. And thanks everyone for the discussion. I hope you all learned something. And besides that, you might also notice from the Access Atlas that community level factors also affect your risk to be food insecure, right? So this graph here is by Professor Christopher. So their research group looked at the square footage of supermarkets one can access in Massachusetts. So this is a map of Massachusetts. And here on the map, the white places are locations where you cannot access a supermarket within 30 minutes of public transportation. So these are places with very low food access. So you can imagine if you live in one of those areas, then if you don't have a car, even if maybe you have higher income, you may still have a higher risk to be food insecure just because you can't access it. You may also notice this map, which shows a state-level food insecurity estimate. And you may wonder, what are the county-level estimate? What are about places where I live? And if you look online, you will see that statistics is often provided from this website. This is created by a food bank called Feeding America, and they calculated the Mind the Meal Gap calculation. So essentially what they did is that they fit a linear model, or you can think of as they calculated the state level security level reported by USDA as a weighted average of the state level population characteristics like unemployment rate, household income, and different racial compositions, etc. And then once they have that model, they plug in these estimates with the county level characteristics, like the county level summer statistics, and they get a county level estimate. And that's how you get this map. And when I saw this map, I feel like it may be missing a few things. So first, it's missing maybe the compound. It may not characterize well the compound effect of if you share multiple of these factors beyond weighted averages. A second thing I noticed is that it also does not account for how these characteristics jointly occur in a population. So what are the percentage of people who are both unemployed and are below poverty rate, and etc. It's probably not, it may not be a weighted average. And I think the third thing, maybe a more nuanced point, is that this also does not consider, this considered individual level effects, and it does not consider community level characteristics, right? So it may not tell us as much about what we can do as an intervention. So what we want to do is that we want to rethink the model a little bit so we can develop an individual level model to quantify the risk of an individual and also build a synthetic population to estimate the population level food insecurity. So let me explain a little bit more. So if you imagine we're in a neighborhood and we have people living in different areas of the neighborhood, then maybe the first question we can ask is, if I am someone living here, what's my risk to be food insecure? What's someone's risk to be food insecure if they live here and with certain kind of individual characteristics? And then we can also ask, what are this community level food environment in this neighborhood? So for instance, how affordable are healthy food in this environment, like in this neighborhood? And finally, we can also ask, what are the household characteristics in this neighborhood? So what is the jointly occur within this neighborhood. And once we have all of these ingredients, we can put it together, tell us the population level risk of food insecurity. That hopefully account for all of these factors that I mentioned earlier. So this is much of a work in progress. So I'll tell a bit about what we have done so far and what we are continue doing next. So I also want to tell you a bit about our approaches. So our first step is that we want to know what's the likelihood that someone lives in a food insecure household given their individual characteristics and maybe neighborhood characteristics. And we start from individual characteristics. And for this purpose, we use a probability forest. The idea of a probability forest is it's an aggregate of probability trees. And you can think of a tree as a sort of this sort of flow chart where each step you ask a question about that household. So say, do they have high income? If yes, do they live with minors, or how many minors do they live with? And if yes, then you predict a certain probability that that household is food insecure. And if you end up at different, have different answers to these questions, you end up at different leads, and that gives you different estimates at the end. And once we have this estimate, you can also ask which of these factors are more important, depending on how often you need to ask questions at this specific variable. Because if you need, if this branches out more at how much income you have, that means income has a big effect on whether somebody is food insecure or not. So we use this on with the U.S. Post Household Survey. So U.S. Post Household Survey is it's a bi-weekly data and it's publicly available. And the goal is to get an update view of the challenges U.S. households are facing. So it's really so we used this in Massachusetts in 2003, and we looked at how important each factor is, and we see that unsurprisingly, your income, your education, and your age has a big impact on your household food insecure probability. And once we have that, the next thing we do is that we call it simulating a synthetic population, which is you can also think of as understanding how likely are joint characteristics to occur in a population. So the idea is that we use iterative proportional fitting. So the idea is if we imagine we have a big table at the state level, practice, we can also estimate this big survey data. And then imagine we also have the county level marginals at each county, and we can get it from the census data. And then use iterative proportional fitting to calculate a county level table. And the idea is that we are going to keep all of these marginal data, but also keeping the joint distribution as close to the state level table as possible. And it will populate this county level estimate of what are the joint how likely are these characteristics likely to occur jointly in a and then we combine these to come up with an estimate. So this is sort of using our approach, got this estimate in Massachusetts in 2023. And we also can compare it with the Mine-to-Meal gap estimates. And mostly align with each other. There's some differences in some, and it could be interesting to think about why there are these differences. You can see that it mostly align pretty well. And finally, I want to tell you a little bit about the ongoing work, which, as I said before, we also want to be able to understand the local food environment, which is how affordable or healthy food that I can access physically. So we're combining 3 data sets to understand this question. The first one is the USDA My Plate data, which tells us what is the composition of a healthy meal given somebody's age and gender and so on. And second, we're using a retail scanner data that gives us a sample of the retailers in the US, and you can think about in Massachusetts, that tells us which location they're in, for instance, which county they're in, what type of store it is, like is it a convenience store, is it a supermarket, what type of product it sells, and how much do they sell them, and what are the prices. So this will give us an idea of how affordable these healthy food are. And finally, we also have a map of all the food retailers in Massachusetts, which tells us what's the location and the category of the store of all the stores in Massachusetts. So we want to be able to combine these two information to get a sense of how affordable are stores near, maybe say, where we live. To summarize, we developed an individual level model to estimate the risk of food insecurity and simulated synthetic population to estimate the population level. And in the future, we also want to create a map of local affordability and access to nutritious meals. And also we want to incorporate these environments into our individual level models to come up with a more accurate model tailored to a community. I think that's all I want to talk about. And if you, please let me know if you have questions.
Thanks, this is really interesting. My question is, how do they estimate the numbers that you showed at the beginning in household might be?
I think that is from the American American Community Survey, American Population Survey. They have a food insecurity supplement. So I think maybe every year they ask like several U.S. households these questions, like these questions related to food insecurity, and then they combine it in some way. For instance, like if you answer more than 4 yeses in the following questions, then you get your foods. That's how they come up. These data are only yearly, so and they also have a county level because they don't have a big enough sample, and also they want to protect individual parties that they don't have information.
Does the data keep from example, when I go through the office and I do a bunch of surveys, does the survey data that I fill out for my doctor, does that keep data that's not data, sorry. But number one, and question number two, and these open some of the other boxes explore it. But I think we have all heard about the people nitrate atoms that are not nitrate anymore. How does that affect your model?
For question one, yes, we don't use data because we don't have access. But I think these could actually be very useful in the sense that if you really want to be able to, well, it's useful in two ways. One is it's for intervention purposes, because one way to think about intervening is that maybe someone goes to a doctor's appointment and they give you a prescription of food, and they say these are the areas where you can get food or you can choose. The other is it's a good way, like it's very useful for validation because even though I have an estimate, but we really don't know what's the county level. So it may be able to give us a bit of a validation of what's the actual county level. Regarding the second question, yes, it would. We haven't used the new one yet, so we're just using the current one. I assume if we actually like thinking about like they're recommending different kind of categories of food as well, and you get different categories of food from different kind of markets. So I would imagine like they will affect.
I was wondering, do you have a sense of how much or what are the causes of food insecurity that are different than general types of economic hardship? I mean, I just know some variables, and I imagine that affects what policy responses should be.
So didn't mention, so usually when people think about food insecurity, they think about four factors like affordability, so that's like cheap, and accessibility, which is like good. Third one, availability, like maybe just living in an area where there's still like no fresh food or something. But there's also utilization, which is like some people they can buy food, they don't cook in a way that's healthy. So these are the factors that are not just income. I think we haven't really thought about utilization, which is I think another maybe important aspect of insecurity, like prevention, so people can how to prepare to eat.
I think the methodology itself. Yeah, that makes sense. So all the data we do have all the data for other locations. So like if we think about intervention, like it's easier for us to think about intervention in Massachusetts than if we do other like other things. It's still useful as a maybe an estimate, but for Massachusetts, I think it's also useful in terms of thinking about what things like once you identify this location or something. Helpful.
So, in total for individual factors, check is surprise income and age, access, and in terms of each of them, predictive or indicators. Some of it, I would imagine that urban rural areas might accept more than areas. But I'm guessing, so I wonder if there are not beyond individual characteristics that are
That's something we want to think about more in the future. I think it's a bit more difficult because like in the best data, you don't know where that person exactly lives. And you can imagine even if that person lives in an urban area, like there are still like I've seen places where you're in the center of a city, but the only place you can go to in 10, 20 minutes is a Whole Foods, which is pretty expensive. Like it doesn't mean if we live in an urban area, directly accessible to like affordable grocery. So I think it's a little bit more difficult, especially because these data, they do not contain individual location information. But to understand that, I think the next step that I think we want to do is that, you know, in the US, in the like the American Community Survey, which they report the food insecurity, they also ask people questions like, do you have food insecurity because you cannot access a location? And if you imagine that, you may be able to get some idea of like, suppose somebody is living in an area where they do not have public transportation access, what's the chance of their food? And you look at a place on the map and say, well, this place has a very low access. So then for individual living there, maybe I can come up with an estimated what's their risk. So you need to so I guess the answer, the challenge is that we don't readily have these data available. So we might need to combine them in a way that kind of give us some idea about the somewhat. But I do think there's
was ACS not here?
no, I think they yes unless so for public, like I don't think they will come to I think they don't even have county level, they only have like state and metropolitan. So they don't have a big size. People living in this similar state, and then if they have a similar kind of
Yes, I'll ask another question. I remember from the IDS on affordability and access, the like those kinds of is that a thing to say? I didn't see that in this presentation, but I'm wondering whether the type of community that lives in this and the type of food that there's a match or a mismatch. The grocery store sells pasta, but I don't eat pasta, I don't want to cook pasta. It is not relevant.
we did a little bit of analysis of vegetables. So first of all, I think I want to acknowledge that I think the data has some limitations, and that I think data may not, because it's a sample of retailers, it may not
some limitations data. We looked at vegetables. I can show it because I didn't submit it early enough to get approval to show it, but we're looking at like what type of vegetables a supermarket sells. And there's some, you can get some information about maybe what type of vegetable. Are there like on the data just tell you like it's a special kind of vegetable or what's the name of the vegetable, and you can see if this is something that like maybe specific. So you can get some of it. Looked at it a little bit. I guess the thing we saw, which is not surprising, is like you only get vegetables in supermarkets mostly. Like you don't really get much vegetables in convenience stores, and we can get some strong vegetables. Like how do they eat them?
So if supermarkets are the main space that you guys are finding, is there also a category for like bodega? Each grocery stores?
I think that's a limitation. Hard for me to tell. Like, I think I would be much more confident to say know a lot about supermarkets. But I wouldn't be very confident to say, well, we know have a good amount of information about these folks. We need to make, if we were to say something about it, we wouldn't stop about what we say. If you will say, well, I know this store is a Asian store, and then maybe I imagine they're more likely to sell vegetables, or more likely to sell this type of food, and their price rate is more like this. I think it's hard. Like we need to put in some like human assumptions about. That's why we have to work hard.
To ask you an unfair question if I can. When I was looking at the links that you shared, it looks like there, and I'm forgetting the details now. The second link you shared had an atlas of places where there was less access. And this area was highlighted. You know anything, I mean, maybe we have not a great supermarket in Amherst, and
It's the opposite. But in Europe, they're less secure than the back.
oh, really?
Yeah,
We're less used.
yeah, they're better off. But I think we are in a desert. Every the measurement is 30%. So, all of that, I think it shows our sense of strength.
This is full common full access 10 miles. So it's that I think it's 1 mile in urban and 10 miles in. If you see a place. I don't know why.
I mean, we do, I mean, student bodies are not known to be high income,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
It's not, somehow it's not scrolling closely enough, but our area was green. Is this an accurate?
Yeah, but yeah.
No, it's not in there. Methodology. I would imagine, I just like, when you imagine like 10 miles, you can imagine it's like a 10-mile of radius. You can also imagine it's 10 miles of like hard transportation. So that's a little different. I'm not sure what they exactly did. It could be just a radius or that, and it will lead to different answers. Like,
Well, thank you so much, Jen. This is. If people want to follow up with you, do you want to put your email maybe on the board also?
yeah.
Thank you all for coming.
Yeah, just, I just want to say, so, we took people who came in late. If you want to present yourself, at any of our joint things or, at an IDS seminar, afternoon, you are, at the days, that's one. Second thing I forgot to say is
brochure that tells you what types of research is funded, like little videos of research piece, and something that says what our grants have generated. On either of these, they're upfront. Thank you. Thank you guys for coming.
Thanks.
Thank you.